You're listening to 3rd Wave Trade Talks, a podcast that explores the dynamic world of global trade and compliance. I'm Grant Sernick, Head of Sales and Marketing at 3rd Wave, where we empower businesses to master the complexities of international trade. Join me as I sit down with industry experts, innovators, and thought leaders to explore the trends, challenges, and insights that shape the future of global trade. All right, we're live. Today, I've got Eric Johnson. Eric, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on, Grant. So Eric Johnson, I'm day job is senior technology editor at the Journal of Commerce, where I've been for going on 7 years. I've spent about 20 years in total covering the logistics space for various trade publications and newspapers in Southern California initially. The last, I would say now 12 to 13 years has been focused entirely on tech. And that is both from an international and domestic kind of dimensions and logistics, transportation, as well as a bit of trade compliance dimensions as well. So,
okay, well, let me further color that a little bit. So, pretty much, Eric, you are the preeminent technology writer in the logistics and supply chain space. I can't think of anyone really that even comes close to sort of your both sort of your position that you hold at the Journal of Commerce, which is one of the premier news outlets for this kind of stuff. But also nobody's really commenting the way you comment, and I've always appreciated certainly our relationship that we have and your thoughts on stuff. And so I'm excited that you're on Trade Talks, and we're just getting. I mean, I think, as you know, we're just getting this podcast going, and so it means a lot that you're willing to give us your time. I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts. You've been a good friend to 3rd Wave for a long time, and so we certainly appreciate you.
I always appreciate our talks too, Grant. So when you invited me, I was honored and really looking forward to this. We have lots of interesting chats offline, so it's nice to have like public chat.
Well, indeed, and I'm I don't know that we've had this conversation before, but I really do find the podcasting medium to be pretty unbelievable. Where if you find the right podcasts to listen to, you really get to know the people that are having the conversation. I want to say are being interviewed, but that's not really the right framework to look at. They're really conversations, and so I feel like I'm friends with a lot of the podcasts and guests that I listen to. I have a set of podcasts I listen to that are very, very informative, and I love the medium, and so I'm really thrilled that I get to have these conversations with people generally I like, because the only people I have onto podcasts are people that I like to have conversations with. And so I hope that other people sort of get the same sense on this podcast that we're trying to do, specifically as it pertains to logistics and supply chain. And I think my thoughts. I really hate the bullshit that exists in our industry and many industries, and so hopefully we don't do that.
Yeah, I obviously, as someone who's spent my entire career in media, I obviously have taken a very big interest in the rise of podcasts, and try to understand what makes the successful ones work and what makes maybe underappreciated ones not get the attention they deserve. I mean, I think in general they fall into like a couple different buckets. The ones that I enjoy listening to, they're either really short, quick kind of things that you can digest in a fairly short period of time, or they're long form, kind of like you feel like you're listening in on a private discussion in a way. And you get to really know the person or set of people over a long period of time. But it's not, there's some like intangible secret to to this. Like, I don't think if you go on Twitter, everybody has a playbook for engagement and this, that, and the other. And it's like, it's all nonsense, right? Like, I mean, they work for some organic reason that's really difficult to pin down. And two people could do the exact same thing in a podcast, and one would be wildly successful and the other would stink, and so it's interesting to watch and observe.
Yeah. Well, I think that, what you're commenting on really is around the idea, like, okay, when I was doing my MBA, we had a class in leadership, right? And invariably there's a problem with leadership classes, generally speaking, in that you're being taught by somebody who is like a professor at a school, which
and not necessarily like a business leader. Yeah.
Well, almost definitionally they are not, because
right.
Profs don't lead anyone. They're just there. And then what they're doing is sort of like a retrospective on when you take a somewhat scientific, probably not very scientific look at leaders, these are common traits that you would find in them, and you're trying to teach those common traits to these people as if only you were able to do these things, you would be a great leader. And it's like, well, that's not quite true. Like, most great leaders do these things, but just because you do those things doesn't mean that you're a great leader. And so you look at books like Good to Great, and I don't know if you ever read that book, but that was like a book around, it looked at, I think the authors looked at, like, on the S&P, they found companies that were consistently grew more than 10% a year for 30 years or something like that. Turns out it's like 13 companies. And then they went into those 13 companies and looked at all the commonalities that those 13 companies had, and were like, it's explained as if, again, they wouldn't necessarily say it this way, but except this is what you take away is, like, if you try to build a company with these 13 or with these traits, then maybe you'll be able to have a company like these 13 companies, like Coca-Cola and IBM and whatever else. I was like, yeah, but probably of the, other 500 companies or 5,000 companies that didn't make the cut, you'd be able to find a lot of those companies that still had those traits.
Sure.
Right. And so when it comes to podcasts and like the playbook for how to do podcasts, it's like, yeah, probably you got to do those things, but doing those things doesn't necessarily give you a popular podcast. And
there's a lightning in a bottle component to all this stuff, right? It works, and it, sometimes it works. Sometimes I have a show, I do it twice a month. Sometimes I'm super excited to have a guest on because I know we have awesome chats, and I know it's going to be, and then it ends up being whatever. Maybe I'm off that day. Maybe they're off that day. Maybe they speak a little differently when there's a live little thing in the corner of the screen versus when we're just chatting.
Right.
You just never know. And then other times I walk in and I'm like, I don't know what to expect with this. And it ends up being an amazing episode. And I know people dig it, And so, yeah, I mean, we're humans, right? We're not machines, So there's an emotional component to it for sure.
Right. Well, okay, so let's talk. I mean, we're supposed to be talking about supply chain stuff, so let's do a little.
We should do a little bit of that, completely about podcasts. So
yeah. So I wonder, like, if we could start, by just, I want to get your thoughts on what's happening in the world today.
Big question.
It's clear that there was this thing called COVID, and obviously that was, historically, that would have been known as a black swan event, right? These crazy things that happen once in a million years.
The definition of a black swan event, actually.
Yeah. And that threw everything in supply chains into like a totally different world. And now we're through COVID, and one might think that we're back to sort of normal, except, God, there's a lot of craziness that's going on in the world today. I don't know. I'm curious, sort of just at a high level, if you have any comments on sort of what you think we're seeing, and maybe bring it back to technology and what you're seeing in the technology space. But do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, let me start my answer by asking you a question. How long have you been working in this industry?
So I have been working in this industry, I think, for 10 years. So I've been at 3rd Wave. So I was not in
Got it.
international
Okay.
supply chains or supply chains at all, really, until 10 years ago. And so this is my life in supply chain.
Okay. So that's still a pretty good stretch. It's you have like the pre and the post pandemic kind of, view. And that's probably a couple, in a normal, take COVID out, that's like a normal kind of, you'd see kind of a 2 or 3 cycle swing within those 10 years, right? I fortunately or unfortunately am now in my 21st year of covering international logistics. So I can't tell if it's that I've really put the pandemic so far in the rear view that I'm viewing this through maybe rose-colored glasses is not the right way, but like sort of cynical, been through this a few times kind of glasses. I think what's remarkable to me is that the conversations I have with people in the industry right now, yes, some things have changed, right? Like more people are working from home. I work from home, right? There's more things you can do as an organization remotely because of what happened during the pandemic, and things got pushed to their breaking point and survived for the most part. And now we know that can work in that way. Everyone doesn't have to be located in an office, right? So that's just the obvious one. But I would say that the more interesting thing is many of the conversations that I have with people in international logistics aren't all that different in August of 2024 than they would have been in August of 2014 or August of 2004. We're still beholden to a whole bunch of things. Carrier shipper relationships, dependency on freight forwarders to do this, dependency on customs brokers to do this. A rail strike throws everything out of whack. Longshore potential strike has the potential to throw things out of whack. Canal shuts down, you have to reroute and your transit times increase, and you have to account for that in your inventory cycles, right? None of those things are, I don't think, handled all that differently than they would have been handled in 2014, right? So there's actually a consistency in the industry that I think is underappreciated, regardless of like how crazy the events that have happened over the past few years are. I think my personal opinion is the way we consume news now creates the sense that more things are going on all of the time than, actually there was probably just as much going on in 2014. It's just we didn't have, Twitter and, all these other sort of like instantaneous news gathering mechanisms to make us feel like stuff was just breaking all the time everywhere. So that's my opinion. I may be wrong on this. I may be ignoring some big substantial structural changes to the way people do things. And let me point out one that I think has changed. I talk about this all the time with shippers, and this is to do with rates specifically. The one thing that has fundamentally changed in the world of ocean freight is that prior to the pandemic, the amplitude between what was a high rate and what was a low rate was relatively the same, right? So
Right.
$4,000 rate on the Trans-Pacific was really high. 4,500 was like, are you killing, you guys are killing me here.
Right.
And then you get, we actually saw 0 and kind of negative rates on Asia, Europe, mid 2010s, right? So the wave, if you think of like rates as a wave, the midpoint of that wave is what like equilibrium in the market, and the height of the wave was roughly the same as the floor. All that changed, right? It was possible for supply chains to account for $20,000 spot rates and $10,000 contract rates when you lumped everything in, right? Even 7,000, which would have been unthinkable in 2019. right? So that has definitely changed the market in a very structural way, because now it is possible, people understand that it is possible to still run supply chains, global supply chains, with rates that were thought of as impossible. Now, you can't go much lower than zero. So the amplitude difference benefits carriers because it can only go so low, but it can go way higher. To me, that is a major structural change to the market. But taking this back to technology, I mean, you're meeting with customers all the time. Do you feel like there's been a massive change in the way they think about technology, the way they think about like they're managing their supply chains in 24 versus 2019?
So, I mean, the short answer is no. And the longer answer is yeah, but. And I actually think that there are a couple things that have changed in 10 years that are going to be really, that I think it's not the long term, but, you know, they will play out in a 2, 3, 4 to 10 years, something like that.
Yep. So
the first one, which is a more recent one, is sort of the, like, you know, broadly speaking, AI, and I don't thought, like, not AI writ large, AI very, very specifically in the IDP realm, intelligent document processing.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that you can, listen, for the last, I want to say 50 years, but it's not 50 years. It's probably the last 30 years. PDFs have been the one consistent way of translating information, right? That in international transportation, and probably even in domestic transportation. Like, you have, if it's either paper, like, or, you know, if we want to go back 50 years, it's paper, or it's the digital representation of paper, which is a PDF. Like, one of those two things.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people miss this thing, which is that a PDF is not really data. It's just like information on a sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. And when everybody says that international supply chains are broken, what they really mean is that there's a disconnect in the way data is able to be transferred between parties. And it was virtually impossible. Like, OCR, which was the old technology, optical character recognition, was just never very good, right? And so it wasn't a useful tool to use to get information into data. And in the last 2 years, I want to say that problem
has actually
it's interesting. It's been solved. Like, I'm willing to go as far as to say it's been solved, or at least practically speaking, it's been solved. If it's not bulletproof today, it will be tomorrow. Right?
It's very reliable. I would put it that way. It's very reliable.
It's pretty reliable. Yeah.
Not perfect, but it's reliable. Yeah.
It's reliable. And so, and if it's not reliable today, tomorrow it will be. And when I mean tomorrow, like literally tomorrow, right? Yeah. Or 6 months from now, or a year from now. Like, you know, we're on, you know, GPT 4.0. The next version is going to be brilliant at this, right? So, but it presents a different problem, right? And this is, I think this is where most people miss what really is going on, and where there's been a dramatic change, and it's going to lead to sort of the second big thing, which is data is going to be reasonably pervasive and available tomorrow, or is today. I mean, ultimately it is today. And what's happened specifically on the shippers and the BCO side is that because data has never been available, the need for systems that are able to process the relevant data has been zero. Why would you build or invest in a system that is designed to process supply chain data when that supply chain data wasn't available for you to use, right? There's no management team.
Like building a car based on a fuel that has not been invented yet.
Correct. That's exactly right. And so, like, why would anybody greenlight that kind of project? And the answer is, well, they wouldn't, generally speaking, right? And okay, so now this new fuel, I think it's a great analogy. This new fuel has been invented, right? It's data, supply chain data. And now nobody has a car to run. And so companies are now behind the 8 ball because the possibility of companies having a technology structure to really deal in international trade when many business, I mean, there are lots of businesses that don't deal in international trade. So let's ignore those companies for a second. But for the ones that really are dependent on international trade as their lifeblood, so, you know, what we're talking about, apparel companies, automotive companies, aerospace companies, pharma companies, like
high tech.
I mean, pretty much like that world that is involved in international trade needs, they need this technology backbone that is designed to deal specifically in data and process and international trade, right? And largely that doesn't exist. And the ERPs, for those that think that the ERP is the solution, it's not, right? The ERP, for a whole host of reasons, is not the answer. And so like this data being made available and ubiquitous is sort of the first innovation or the first change that I've seen, in my 10 years of being in the supply chain. So that's the first one. And the second one is...
Yeah, that's very fair.
The second one then would be in the last however long, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years since the internet, let's say, there's a new type of company that has come to the fore. Everybody calls them e-com companies, but really they're digital first companies that there is no business unless it's digital, right? And by virtue of that, and Rob Garrison and I have had, Rob, right? From,
of course.
He's now with WiseTech, but he was with Mercado Labs.
Well, he started Mercado, but he was with a bunch of, he was a shipper, forwarder, and a carrier, I think, in his previous.
Yeah. So I think he made the comment, and I like 100% agree with it, that the e-com companies, what they excelled at, or it was a requirement. So like the ones that are successful, of course, would have excelled at this, is the business out to the customer, right? Everything had to be digital, right? Because you can't sell stuff online if it's not. And so it's very, very well structured company out to the world, on the sell side. And these companies that are digital first over there are going to be very quick to the vendor in side, the buy side of it, to get to digital, right? And they're more oriented towards that, whereas call them legacy companies or the more brick and mortar type companies don't necessarily see they're not very good on the sales side, and they're not particularly good on the buy side. And technology is a real problem. And so in this world where data is ubiquitous, you actually don't really have a choice, because there are going to be two types of companies: those that can deal with the data and use it to their advantage, in which case they're going to succeed, or those that don't, in which case they're likely going to fail, or at least the success is going to come from somewhere else, right? And so I just think that the idea of being a digital first company isn't an option anymore, or won't be in the next 5 to 10 years.
So this is a very, 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 that's 3 very interesting topic, because I have had some permutation of what you just said sort of pitched to me, not pitched, but like brought up to me a lot over the last few weeks, I would say. I think there's people that are very similarly minded about this topic as you are. The problem for me is, when I think about that, is the companies that are digital first, whether you call them direct to consumer or e-com or, kind of digital sellers, whatever, the ones that have been empowered to get their business up and running really quickly based on like digital storefront technology and cool customs engines that, were never available. Like, I mean, personally, it's amazing. I was in India over the summer, and the ability to buy from virtually any seller in the world and have it delivered to India is a new, and have it priced with duties and taxes all like lumped in. It may be not reasonable to pay, but the ability to do that, to make that transaction, literally was not available even like a year prior. So the advance on that is happening incredibly quickly. The problem is, if you look at the volume of trade being moved, if you look at the number of companies that are digital first, they far exceed now the ones that are not. But if you look at the volume of freight that's being moved by those companies versus the non-digital first companies, it's a pittance still, right? We're big importers and exporters are not digital first, but they control the preponderance of all the trade volume still. We haven't flipped. Now that's changing a bit with the Temu and the Shein and all those types of sellers, but that, we're still not at a point where like the big 10 importers into the US still control this massive amount of volume alone. And then you span it out to the 100, it's like, I don't know what proportion of volume they. So the question, I think, is to what extent do the digital first companies influence the way the big importers who are not digital first do things versus do the non-digital first ones just kind of like occupy the market in a way that it doesn't matter if they go digital or not? Now you're suggesting they will have no choice at some point, and that may be true, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah. So my response to that would be, I think that you're describing the world in any disruptive market at the very, very front end of that disruption.
Sure.
Right.
I'm totally willing to accept that may be the case.
Right. And so like when you look at, let's say, Amazon, right? And Amazon is, I don't even know where they stand on like importer volume into the United States as an example. My guess is they run their own planes and ships and stuff like that. So they've got to be
very difficult to carve them out because it's like they don't report in a way that is like their volume versus their seller volume versus third party.
What are they doing logistics for?
And not purely as a logistics provider, right? So it's right. Very difficult to carve out. It's
very but we would agree that it's probably high, right?
Of course,
and they
absolutely.
Okay, and they didn't exist in any significant way 10 years ago, right?
Sure.
And and so the question is like, are they the leading edge, right? And then you look at like, then, I would go to Walmart, right? Walmart was, certainly prior to Amazon would be the behemoth, bar none, right? They're probably more akin to a digital first company than they are to a legacy. They truly transformed into a digital first.
Yeah.
And Target transformed into a digital.
It started to look a lot like what Amazon does in many ways.
Exactly.
So yeah.
And then Target sort of was able to do it as well, right? Mm-hmm. They're reasonably digital first. So, but my point would be that there are going to be some companies that choose to do it and are successful at it, and now they're digital first, even though you don't see them or think of them as digital first, but they certainly understand that that's what they're doing. And so, so Amazon, Walmart, Target, if we just take those three, there are going to be a set of companies that try to do it, and for whatever reason, my biggest expectation would be culture is one of the reasons why they won't be able to make the leap, and they're going to go away. And then you have basically any new company that is coming online today is going to a greater or lesser extent be a digital first company, right? And those companies are not going to have the baggage, or as our CTO likes to call it, technical debt, or cultural debt, or whatever it is of the legacy companies. And what you're going to see are the Temus and the Shines and the more what would you call it? Like it's just forward-looking companies. They're just gonna all of a sudden come and take over.
There's very likely a brand that does not exist today that will be a dominant player in 10 years.
Correct.
because
And that's sort of, and that's my point.
At some point, Walmart was the big bad bully, and Amazon came along. And at some point, Sears was the big bad bully, and Walmart came along. And so this cycle repeats. Like don't forget there will be a time in the near future where Amazon is looked upon as like, geez, these guys really dropped the ball.
Right?
Did they not see this?
And it isn't,
like that kind of thing. So
yeah, and from my perspective, it's not. Could you not see it coming? Although that's what everybody's going to say. It's like transforming from something that you were to the next evolution is insanely hard.
Difficult.
Like insanely hard.
Especially
there are a whole. What's that?
Especially the bigger you get, it's way harder to. Yeah,
exactly. And the reasons not to do it are so significant. I mean, I was talking with a colleague yesterday about Apple and just sort of where Apple is today. And everybody looks at Apple as sort of like the big behemoth, except you look at everything they do and it's so non-Apple today, right? Like, so they have Apple Fitness, and Apple Fitness is like, I don't even know what they're doing with Apple Fitness. There's Apple Fitness. There's, there's like a whole bunch on the software side that, Apple Music is not nearly as good as like some of the other services.
Sure.
And you just sit there and you're like, you go through all these business lines, like they're sort of just ripe for Steve Jobs coming back and saying, guys, like we're shit canning all of this stuff because our core is not this other stuff.
Yeah, true.
And, but it's hard. Like Tim Cook's an operator and he is maximizing, money today, except you can only squeeze so much, blood from a stone, as they say, or you can't squeeze any blood from a stone. I'm not sure, but, you know, and at some point the party ends and now you're left with something and you have to reorganize it. And it's a very difficult exercise to do, especially if you're the biggest company in the world. But it doesn't matter because even if you're a small company, it still seems like you're the biggest company in the world to you. It's your only world.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about big companies for the most part, but like to me, the most interesting ones are the ones that are between those like small digital first sellers that may be influencing the way the market thinks about things, and the big companies with a huge amount of capital that if they fail at something, it's not existential. They have enough buffer basically to like try things and hope one of them works. There's a lot of companies that are very in the middle, that are very conservative because they don't have that buffer. They can't make mistakes. They can't invest in the wrong thing. They can't use the wrong tech for 3 years and recover from it. Those are the companies, I guess, that were in my mind when I initially said, like, you know what? At least from a international freight perspective, not all that much has changed. The change is incremental. Or what you see is a lot of those companies relying on their 3PLs, whether it's a forwarder or an NVO or a domestic 3PL, to essentially be their innovation arm, right? Like let them try and fail, provide me something. It's not on my P&L. It's not on my, I'm not saddled with this because they're the one who has to develop it for me. Let them, bear that cost and bear that headache and then provide it to me and I'll pay for it. I think that's what you see in that market. And I totally empathize with those people, right? Like they're getting a million different ideas in their head about the way this is going, about the way procurement is going, about the way the customs compliance is going, about like visibility. And, there's just a million things. It's like, lasers flying all over your head. Like, which one do I look at? So
that's a great. I think it's a great point. And how do I? I mean, I've got so many thoughts on this one point about the outsourcing from shippers or BCOs to their forwarder. Which is, so firstly, let me acknowledge that that's exactly what many, many companies do. It also is the problem. So or it's at least one of the problems. So I've done it. This is an area where I've done a lot of thinking and writing on.
Sure, of course, yeah.
Around, right? Like there's a significant problem that exists that I think most people don't really understand, and they don't understand it because the market has educated them incorrectly as to the way things are, and they ultimately don't know any better, and nobody really speaks up to explain to them why it's different, which is sort of why I'm on my mission. But so let me lay out a framework for you, and you can comment on sort of this. So, okay, for any company, let's call it, like, take a Nike or a Walmart, doesn't really matter. You have what is happening inside the company, and then so let's call that the inside world, and then you have what's happening outside. So in the global supply chain, which is outside of your company, that's the outside, right?
Yep.
Inside your company, you have various departments that are all trying to do. They're all actors in this play that are trying to accomplish. They're on the same mission, ultimately, right? You're going to buy stuff overseas. You're going to move those things somewhere here, and then you're going to sell them domestically. Let's say if you're like an importer distributor, right? So you're going to buy stuff cheap, sell stuff more expensively. If you do that whole thing appropriately well, you will be profitable, and if you do it poorly, you're going to be losing money, right? Okay, so you have sales and operations, you have finance, you have marketing. Everybody has their own little piece of the pie that they're trying to do, and that's largely focused on buying a widget, figuring out what to do with it internally. Maybe you're manufacturing, transforming it, and then selling it, and you're going to sell that widget to somebody, right? And so you have the product that's moving through, and you have the costs that are going through, and you have to be conscious of those costs at the product level and to be successful. That's the inside world, right? In the outside world, you have a different story that's going on. In the outside world, it is largely operated by third parties. So you have forwarders and carriers and customs brokers and all of those different players. And what they generally care about is a box, and that someone, before it gets into my outside world, is going to put all this stuff in a box. I'm going to be contracted to move that box. There are going to be many actors in this. You have a drayage provider. You might have a rail, ocean, rail again, another drayage provider, and then it's going to get to me, and that has to be organized, right? So inside the company, the inside world deals in product. Outside, it deals in shipments, essentially, or containers. And they're truly different languages. Okay, now it just so happens, and this is where things get really, really confused, that there's a team within the company that's called the transportation team, right? And to a certain extent, the trade compliance team can fit into that. But the trade compliance team deals in the outside world, basically. They are the intermediary between the outside world and the inside world. They sit inside the company, and everybody thinks that because they're inside the company, they are part of the inside world. But practically speaking, they're not. They're part of the outside world. They need to deal with that outside world, right? And so they're like a little carve out within that inside world to deal with the outside world. Okay. And they're supposed to support the stakeholders in the inside world. And generally speaking, they have none of the tools to do it. Right. And so you have these two worlds that are operating totally independently, one from the other, speaking really in different languages, one in the language of shipments, the other in the language of product.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just said was, we're going to get the outside world guys to try to innovate for us and be able to meet our needs inside. And they don't have the foggiest clue what you need to be successful inside. They truly don't. And so I get a lot of shade thrown at me. Largely, I've got a lot of forwarder followers. And so when I make that comment, they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. But in this instance, I actually do, because all my customers are these kind of customers. Yeah. And it's not like I don't blame them for having the perspective they have. They truly don't know any better, right? They've never worked in there, and they don't understand that product is the only thing that matters to the inside world.
I know you've made this case before, so I totally get where you're coming from on this. I might quibble a little bit and say that I think, because a lot of forwarders have worked as shippers, right? Like I think, and maybe they've only worked, a lot of people at forwarders have worked at shippers, and maybe they've only worked on the transportation side. So they have this container, sort of view of the world, even though they were in that shipper world. It should have also thought about product. I honestly think it comes down more to resource than it does to them not understanding, right? Like, as a forwarder, as much as you would like to have a tailored offering to every single shipper that you work with, after a while, that doesn't scale. And so you have to sort of homogenize the offering across, if you're a big forwarder, thousands of customers. And that necessarily means you're missing the specificity of each of your customers, or some of the specificity of each of your customers. So some of them may think, some shippers may have a very containerized view of the world, even though they're moving product, probably not far outnumbered by the ones that you're talking about, which think product first, and we just have to use a container to move that product. But I honestly think it's like a numbers game, and because of the margin that they work on, you can't be all things to all people in the way that you would need to be, because each shipper is so different in how they view the world. But a big picture, I don't disagree with you. I think there's a huge disconnect between even internal teams and how they view moving stuff across oceans. And certainly when you start to get to external partners, they have a view of the world. I mean, what you were describing is something that I think about too, is like, the thing that bugged me the most, probably like my biggest pet peeve during the pandemic, was when you would read about the global supply chain, as if like everybody was using one single pipe, right? Like all the same pipe, they just put it all in on one end and it all came out on the other. And then everyone like collected their stuff, like parents picking up their kids at school, right? Like, there is not a global supply chain. Most companies don't even have a single supply chain. They have multiple supply chains, right? So it's a semantic thing, but I think it gets at what you're talking about. It's like the way you define your supply chain is sort of like the way you define your company. And if you are move a bunch of like nondescript, replaceable, fungible type of stuff, then you're probably going to think more in a containerized kind of way. If you have a huge number of SKUs with huge variability in your demand, and you have to, get half of your products through this PGA and another half of your products through 3 other PGAs, you're very much going to think about it on a product level. And then do your partners think similarly?
Well, okay. So you made a distinction there. I guess you made a distinction there between those that care about product and those that don't. My point would be, if you're a forwarder, so like, okay, if you care about product, it's complicated, let's say. And if you don't care about product, it's not complicated.
Or less complicated.
My point would be, if you're a forward, like you had made the comment that every company is different and cares about different things. And to an extent that's true, but to an extent it actually is sort of like an excuse that everybody makes, which isn't exactly true. Yep. Which is to say that if forwarders provided product level data, truly like managed their thing, both by shipments moving through and also by products moving through, and made that data available to their customers, that satisfies 100% of the customers. 100%. They might not use it. Some companies
might
be
not overkill for some, but you're not going to make anyone unhappy by doing that.
You're not going to make anyone unhappy. And here's what I know. 0 companies do that. 0 forwarders do that. Now you can pay, when I say they don't do that, you can pay for product management, right? And they might have GT Nexus or something like that to do it. And it's a very, very expensive service. But I'm waiting for a forwarder to put their hand up and say, no, 100% of our shipments are managed at the product level. The data is made available to our customers. And if a forwarder did that, they would then at least pass my hurdle for saying, listen, I get what you guys need. You need product level data moving through, and we are giving that to you. Now, the problem is that they don't have any systems to do it, really. And that really is the problem. And so, like the world is, this one innovation changes totally everything. And I think that the AI piece that we talked about earlier is going to, that the problem on the forwarder side is they're dealing with tens of thousands of shipments a month or something like that, hundreds of thousands of shipments, which is, 100 documents per shipment, and you get to a lot of process. You know what's really good at processing lots of shit? AI. AI is like really, really good at processing lots and lots of data. The more data it has, the better it will be.
Yep.
And if you now are able to layer on product level data onto your shipment level data, be able to provision that up to your customers, you have a totally new class of forward, right? And this was, as far as I was concerned, the promise of Flexport, and they couldn't do it. Now, they might have been 3 years too early, maybe.
Yeah, these are all. I'm interested, if any forwarders are listening to this conversation, to follow up and say either prove or don't prove me wrong, because I think what you're saying, I can never speak in absolutes like that, because I'm not dealing on a intimate customer level conversation level like you are with your customers. And I also have, there's a lot of forwarders that would call me up and argue the point. And I don't really have the ability to say whether they're telling the absolute truth or not. So I have to stay away from absolutes, but I would say in general, I don't think what you're saying is wrong in general. So, as far as Flexport, I think they would argue that they've probably not cracked that nut, but are working toward it in a way that other forwarders aren't or haven't been able to, just because of what you talked about before in terms of technical debt and cultural debt and that sort of thing. But again, this is the hardest part of my job, is wading through what people tell you and the reason why they tell you is a big part of my job. It's sort of like if I think about a system that gives me a piece of data and then assigns a confidence score to it. That's essentially what I, as a reporter, have to do with every conversation I have. Someone told me a piece of information. I have to go and go, why did they tell me this information at all? Was it accurate? What prompted them to tell me it? You have to go through all of those things before you don't just take notes and say, this guy said this, so it must be.
No, I get it.
Nope. So it's and if I know someone long enough and I know that there's a reason why they said it, but that doesn't make it untrue, then that's a fair thing to put into a story with the context that.
Right.
Of course.
Well, here's the thing. Here's why I'm saying it. All of our customers here at 3rd Wave are BCOs.
Yep.
They all need product level data.
Yeah, you're having those conversations with them about what they're missing.
Well, it's our biggest problem, right? Yeah. How do we get that data? Well, we ultimately, because the forwarders don't have the data, and they ought to, we have to go to the vendors, or we have to go to we need to use AI to intelligent document processing to get the data or something, and then we have the data. But we're already integrated with the forwarders for the ASN information. And what we, so the question becomes, who ought to provide the product level data in a shipment, right? And you have two choices: either it's the BCO that is going to do it, which means every BCO now needs to have a specialty or competence in this one thing, or it belongs somewhere else, let's say at the forwarder, where they're doing it for, like, if they were to create a competency in this,
they would want to be paid for it.
Well, even if they listen, it's going to be somebody. It doesn't come for free.
Right.
The question is, who has? So let's say, just pure on like if you were looking at a transaction basis from like an AI perspective, let's say a shipper that moves 5,000 containers, and let's say it's 100 pages per container, so that's 500,000 pages that need to be turned into data of some sort. Okay, well, that's going to have one cost. If you have a forwarder that moves 500,000 or 5 million containers or shipments a year, they're going to, if it's 25 cents a page on one side, it's going to be, cents a page on, for the volume, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
My point is more, it seems to make sense that it would reside in the forwarders. There's another reason why it makes sense on the forwarder side, and it's because it's almost perfect competition, and that would provide a differentiator for your business, that if you're doing this for every shipment, then you're going to gain all of those customers that care about data. But beyond that, I think that their biggest problem is they have a technology problem, right? Because, let's say if CargoWise is the dominant player in the business, they can't do this, right? And that creates a big problem, or at least I don't think they can do this. Anthony Miller, if you're standing out there watching, then maybe you can correct the record. But I don't think they can do this, which means that that forwarders need a new class of software, right? And this might be the disrupting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually just spoke with Richard at CargoWise this week because their earnings came out, and I think he would say that what they are working toward is building that capability to empower their forwarder customers, right, to do that. So I think there is a recognition that is where this needs to go. I mean, I think most of the companies that are trying to develop some sort of alternative to CargoWise are not anywhere near the point of what you're describing. They're trying to build something that is a little bit easier to jump into and costs a lot less than CargoWise for everyone outside of the top 100 or 200 or 300, however you define that top end of the market. And that's the focus, is like something that can get them in the game, essentially, not something that is going to like straight away leapfrog what CargoWise does. Right? So yeah, from that perspective, I think you're right.
Yeah, well, and it's so, again, from a technical perspective, I don't think you can solve the problem that way. I agree that that's how most people would do it, because it's offer less, hit some need really squarely, offer a little bit less and do it cheaply, and then you can get into the market. The problem is that the design of a system that needs to handle and control product just needs to start with the focus on product and then putting the wrapper of a container around it or shipment around it. It is very difficult to go the other way, right? Because the granularity doesn't allow. So anyway, it would be interesting. It would be very, very interesting to see. I think that's where the next real transition in forwarding goes. It's like being able to provide the product level visibility that customers actually want and need.
Yeah.
But let's move. We're this conversation, as I expected, was going to go. The time was going to fly.
We have to. We always should talk about.
Yeah. I wanted to get your sense on the state of investment in LogTech.
Okay.
Obviously, during COVID, that was, I mean, it was the industry. We had our moment in the sun, I guess.
Yep. Yep.
Since then, it's been, well, I don't know, kind of crazy how quickly investments have left virtually everywhere. What are you hearing or seeing in LogTech and funding for LogTech companies?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that we're in a different phase of things now than we were, let's say, it started before COVID. It was 2017, it started to really ramp up. There were a few funding rounds, obviously, before that were pretty sizable, but 2017 is where it started to really ramp up all the way through end of 21. By the first quarter of 22, you started to hear there were still rounds being done, but a lot of them were being announced, things that were being announced in the first quarter of 22 that were actually like, this was money that was already in their bank account, end of 21, say start of 22. That was the gold rush. The sugar high, I guess, is probably a better way to put it, because it was not sustainable. It's tough for me to say whether the amount that was put into the industry was like appropriate or whether it was too much. I mean, it's not really my call to make that. I mean, I guess I have some thoughts on it, but do my thoughts really like, I mean, you said some things at the beginning of this that made me blush a little bit, but like, I don't know if I'm equipped to make a determination about whether there was too much put in or put in the wrong companies, or, this is not my money. This is not your money. This is, this is the model, right? Like, LPs get convinced by funds to put money into them so that they can disperse that to a set of promising companies, out of which one or two in a cohort may hit it fairly big or really big. The rest will either have a middling outcome or get acquired or completely fade away, right? And that's just how it works, right? So I think what we saw in that gold rush period was just the sort of natural crescendo of when there's a lot of activity and there's a lot of money coinciding with an area of business that was getting a ton of attention and seemed to be broken in a lot of ways. I would quibble that it wasn't as broken as it was made to seem. It certainly didn't break as much as the average person thinks it did. Otherwise, like, a lot of us would have starved to death, and we would, it actually held up amazingly well given all the stress that was put up on it. So a lot of companies obviously sold against that crescendo and got rounds that were probably too big for what they could reasonably expect to exit at. So I think we're sort of dealing with more than like reticence from the investor community to keep investing in this. I think we're still sort of dealing with the consequences of companies that really didn't have a path to a huge exit getting more money than they probably should have, right? And so 24 seems like a more normal year. Like, companies that have a unique model have gotten some pretty sizable rounds. There's a lot of seed activity going on, or at least discussions on the seed side. This feels like the precursor to a little bit more stable kind of year in 25 and 26. There were also, I would make the contention that there were way too many startups that emerged all at the same time, and that wasn't healthy for any of them individually. Sort of what I talked about before with like everybody seeing a million different things they needed to invest in companies. It's like no person has the ability to fully understand what 100 different software companies are doing and how that applies to them and whether it's the right fit for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond the scope of what we can reasonably do, especially while we have a day job in addition to that, right? So there were too many names all coming at the same time, sometimes multiple companies trying to address the same problem all at the same time, all getting funding, all having like some marketing spend and all that sort of thing. So that was unhealthy. And I think we're now in a little bit more healthy place from I think of this from the buyer perspective. I find it interesting what's going on the VC side of things and certainly on the founder side of things. But ultimately, what I care about is what does the buyer make of all this? And the buyer was, if you put yourselves in the shoes of your customers or, BCOs in the middle of the pandemic, everything's going haywire. They're trying to keep things, together with masking tape and duct tape and glue, super glue. And they're also getting 1,000 marketing pitches a week for various things. And that was just that's not a good, healthy environment to be in, right? So if all of that stuff is settled down at the same time, that's a much healthier place for people on the buying side to be. So I think we'll start to see like a bit of a recovery in this because the buyer is in a healthier place to consider things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good perspective. So, are you seeing any areas today? I mean, AI maybe is the obvious thing, but like what is from your travels, like what is where are people invest, like where are VCs investing and what are they saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously AI gets a lot of attention, but I would caution anybody buying like an AI product. I mean, I've said this before. You buy a product and it's sort of like a software company saying, we use computers to deliver this product, right? Like, just assume that they are using some sort of AI or machine learning to build their product, but that is not the product itself, right? So like please make sure you're understanding that when you have a discussion with them. But I think a couple areas, procurement to me is still the crux of this all, right? Like if you have an understanding of who to work with, how much to pay them, how their performance should affect what you pay them and the service metrics that you expect of them, that influences everything else, right? And so if you don't have a good process, hopefully underpinned by some technology, to understand that, you're behind the 8 ball. And that's, your point about being like digital first, being a differentiator between the success of companies or not. If you don't have the ability on the procurement side, the freight procurement side, to make very detailed, sophisticated determinations on who you work with and what that relationship is, you're going to struggle in the years ahead, because the carriers, whether it's an ocean carrier, truckload carrier, air carrier, you better believe they are understanding who a good customer is. Day by day, they're getting better at that. So you also have to have the ability to understand what makes you a good customer and what makes them a good service provider. Because ultimately, we talked about the forwarders. Ultimately, the service providers that are irreplaceable are the ones that actually run the physical things, right? And so you have to have whether it's through a forwarder, whether it's direct, you have to have an understanding of what moves the needle. Like a perfect example is there's a ton of data around, and I know I'm not answering your question about what VCs invest in. I don't know. The short answer on that is I don't know. They invest in stuff that I don't think is all that important based on my conversations. I'm telling you, if there's any VCs listening, I'm telling you what I think is important from a buyer perspective. So,
well, just on that point, VCs, you should probably, if you're listening, listen to what Eric has to say here.
Well, so let's talk. Thanks. Let's talk about rates, right? there's more data about what a appropriate or what the spot market rate is in various modes than there's ever been before. But often those publicly available indexes don't tell you, they tell you what the average rate in that market is on the spot side. And sometimes they even will get into contract. They don't tell you over that next week what the actual price that you have to pay is to actually get loaded, right? So that's a difference. That's different, right? So if from a
sorry, just explain that.
So in other words, I may have let's take ocean. I may have a contract rate that I signed. If I'm on the Trans-Pacific, I signed it in spring. I have that with a carrier. I want to move a container from a port in Asia to a destination in the US. I want to use the contract rate that I signed with them because I have a certain number of containers I can move each week. They come back and say, well, the spot rate is $1,000 above what my contract, or say $2,000 above what my contract rate is. They are going to, if I'm not a huge customer, they're likely going to say, well, the spot rate is actually, we can actually get other customers to fill that slot on that ship at this rate. So what would we like to do about this? So in that instance, the rate at which you move is somewhere below what the spot rate, the average spot rate for just Joe Schmo on the street asking for a slot on that ship is. And it's above what you are entitled to in your contract, right? So understanding in a real-time basis what that costs to actually get a container moved is something that like people at logistics teams, they kind of innately know, but there's not really a lot of technology to help determine what that rate to actually move a box is at any given moment, right? They just have to play it by feel, and they have to lean on their relationships. They have to, have a backup in the spot market that can give them, in case they bluff too much, the carrier calls their bluff, they need to have a fallback, right? So those types of things are super interesting to me. And I don't see a lot of like VCs going so granular or looking for companies that are so granular. And maybe it's because it's too hard a problem to solve, and maybe it's not right for VC to solve it. Maybe it's
well, my feeling is that in fact there aren't very many VCs that would truly understand that
scenario.
Story. Yeah, that scenario, right?
True.
Like
there's a few, but not
a lot. And you have a lot of VCs that they'll say they play in the supply chain, as it like the supply chain is crazy.
Supply chain
you can play.
Logistics is not supply chain.
No, exactly. It's virtually everything, right?
Yeah,
everything in business is, and
correct. My favorite story is there was a I can't remember, is a furniture maker or a consumer goods company, and he said 80% of my employees are in supply chain. This is like a CFO. Like that. I mean, that puts like a point on what you're talking about. Like,
right,
there are companies that find virtually every employee in their company as part of their supply chain. Right,
as part of their supply chain.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And so but even those companies that say they have like a vertical, even the VCs that say they have a vertical expertise in supply chain, most don't. And you have like a very small set of VCs that I think really do have an understanding and knowledge of, at a detailed level, what is really happening. And Ocean International is just so different than domestic.
Oh yeah.
And it's very, we're not going to get to this topic of sort of the difference between international and domestic, but
part two.
We can do a part two. Exactly. The difference and distinction and technology requirements to manage one versus the other is just so dramatically different, and creates a whole bunch of problems. But I think we've probably made it. Last set of things. What are you working on these days?
Well, so I probably pretty relevant to your world. I've been I just finished a couple of stories on and relevant to what we talked about before about the e-commerce boom. Did a couple of stories on CBP increasing scrutiny on brokers and sort of raising the future expectations on brokers, like technology investments, basically helping. The expectation being that brokers will not just collect enough information to file an entry, but will have enough information or counsel their import customer to have enough information about their, upstream supply chain to say, whether it's a giant, $10 million shipment or a de minimis $300 shipment, to say with certainty, we didn't violate forced labor, we didn't violate environmental regulations, all those things that are that will bite in the future. So yeah, very, very interesting. And yeah, so that I've been working on that and really like knee deep in that world a lot, which has been fun for me because I don't get to write about trade compliance as much as I would like to. So this was good. And I think I'm going to be writing about it more because of the deluge of de minimis
regulatory.
It's looking at the numbers. There were more de minimis shipments into the U.S. in the first half of 24 than there were in all of 23, and 23 grew huge over 22. So it's a growing.
I think they're going to be reducing the de minimis value quite dramatically.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, now we're going to go into our second hour here just on this topic. But the interesting thing is we have been told that reducing the de minimis level doesn't really alter the problem because a lot of these shipments are already sub $100 shipments or sub $150 shipments. So just merely reducing it to like a level that other countries have doesn't solve the problem. You'd have to take it down to like $20 because...
Well, here in Canada, I believe it is $20, which is just obnoxious is what it is.
That's low. Yeah.
It's pretty low. It's, it's just such a huge problem. The idea of the 321, like there's so many ways. I don't want to call it a loophole because it's not they are designed for enabling moves, right? And so people design their supply chains around these concepts, and changes to them have dramatic impact. But you're right. It is like, and the regulation, more than anything, I think we're going to see in the future changing regulation new regulation.
There are 5 bills in U.S. Congress that have been authored since March. So just this year. And there's a couple others that were put forward in 23 as well. So obviously, if even one of them has legs, we can see changes, certainly.
Right.
So
yeah. And what about what conferences are you working on right now?
Oh, I have a laundry list of things I'm going to this fall. I'll be at I think I have like 7 events that I'm going to. The one I care most about is our own. We have our Inland Distribution Conference in Chicago, end of September. Just ping me on LinkedIn or eric.johnson@spglobal.com if you want more details on that and a code for a discount on pass. That's our sort of surface transportation oriented event. But I'll be at the World Ports Conference. I'll be at Freightos's event in Barcelona in September. I will be at DATCon. I will be at RateLinks' customer event. So yeah, I have a lot of travel in fall. So
all right,
yeah.
Well, I guess this is a good point to end it. Let me so just one more time, where can people find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn, just Eric Johnson. It's you can pick my face out from the probably 50 million Eric Johnsons on LinkedIn. And email is eric.johnson@spglobal.com. You used to be able to find me on Twitter, but I left that cesspool a long time ago. So no thanks.
All right. Well, hey, listen, thank you for the time today. You're always really generous with us, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So I look forward to the part 2 of this, and we'll see you around. Enjoy the travels.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Third Wave Trade Talks. To get in touch and learn more about what we do, visit our website at thirdwave.co. There you'll find more resources to enrich your knowledge of global trade. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.